Welcome to Oncology Morning Commute, targeting STAMP in CML. Morning Commute is developed in collaboration with At Point of Care and Projects and Knowledge and is part of a continuing medical education series. This independent CME-CE activity is supported by an educational grant from Novartis Pharmaceuticals Corporation. In this podcast, Dr. Gerald Radich and Dr. Michael Morrow return with a discussion of a new target for the treatment of chronic myeloid leukemia and the newest treatment on the block, asciminib. Information about the faculty and disclosures can be found at morningcommutepodcast.com/CML2. You can use this link to receive your credit and evaluate this program. The URL can also be accessed in the episode notes. Dr. Radich is a professor in the Clinical Research Division of Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center in Seattle. Dr. Morrow is a professor of medicine and leader of the Myeloproliferative Neoplasms Program in the Leukemia Service, Department of Medicine, at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York City. I am Candace Hoffman, Managing Editor of Morning Commute. Dr. Radich will begin our discussion.
Hey, Mike, Jerry, how you doing?
I'm good. I'm stuck in traffic though, Jerry. I love these morning commutes. You know, it's New York City is a rough place to practice CML care, but let me see if I can roll up the windows here so we can really talk about CML.
Yeah, again, we should probably be talking about something else. It's not like the world is bereft of things to talk about, but certainly few things as interesting or stimulating as, except for maybe the baseball season and the upcoming and the ongoing NBA playoffs. But be that as it may. So I just happened to be reading over for another lecture I have to give, the more recent study of asciminib versus bosutinib. And I think that you're part of that action, and you are the experts, especially compared to me. Maybe could I kind of go over asciminib, how it's different? The company likes to talk about this intelligent design stuff, which makes you think like what versus non-intelligent design? It's like so. Yeah. But there is some interesting stuff to it, and maybe just kind of highlight how it's different. Do we really think it might be better than something like bosutinib in the trials, and sort of the pros and cons, and that takeaway from that study, what you really thought were the important things?
Sure. Yeah. So that is a catchy term, intelligent design, and targeting a STAMP. What is STAMP? Specifically targeting the myristoyl pocket. That's not exactly everyone's bread and butter when they're thinking about CML. But interestingly, from the basic science level, I think when this whole BCR-ABL as a driver of cancer, a singular driver of cancer was unraveled, which was some beautiful work. I think we really saw a couple of potential targets in the kinase. And in retrospect, my understanding is that at the scientific and at the structural chemistry level, allosteric inhibition, or perhaps correcting what was this loss of this myristoyl binding site and something that could affect the myristoyl pocket rather than the ATP binding pocket, which is also very logical, as you mentioned, also intelligent design, could have been a nice alternative. But I think it just took some time for us to see something come to light. We knew there were other allosteric inhibitors in development through the years, but I don't know if anyone was able to get it right with regards to the right chemical structure with the least toxicity and greatest potency against ABL kinase, and something that was just what we were looking for. But lo and behold, I think asciminib is filling a lot of those roles. So I think one of the biggest features of this now is so you have a drug that is complementary to the ATP binding pocket drugs, and you could combine them. I think that was really one of the main reasons to get this to patients. Could we have, as I like to think of it, almost like HIV medicine, not to compare the two conditions, because obviously their implications are quite different, but dual inhibition of a virus in two different pathways and dual inhibition of a leukemic cell, there's a lot of similarities there. You might really have some synergy or some complementary effect. So, preclinically, I think we had a very potent and very limited ABL inhibitor through a different means. We knew we could combine it, and phase 1 study showed us, safe, effective by itself. You could combine it with other TKIs, although interestingly, each drug took different investigation to sort it out because, you now have two drugs in the same system. So you have drug-drug interactions to think about. You may not be worried about drug interactions at the binding sites, sure, but you always got to think about drug-drug interactions. And that work's still, I think, in development, but we clearly had enough information to move it forward. And you mentioned the bosutinib comparative study. So, at the time, as we mentioned in our first podcast, third line therapy, it's a little complicated. So what's your best choice? Is it ponatinib? Could you be using bosutinib as an alternative second generation inhibitor? And then now asciminib's on the block. And that was a fair comparison at the time based on what the labels of the drugs said. And I think it was, it's fair game. And the ASSEMBLE study really showed us that you probably had a better tolerated drug. You had a drug with significantly greater efficacy. You had durable response, and you had more of a winner when it comes to third line therapy. And lo and behold, we got approval. So or Novartis got approval. We helped the effort, all of us as a CML community, to help get our patients on study. And I think, what was your impression of some of these patients? It's pretty amazing stories of some of these patients with pretty bad disease.
It reminds you a lot of the way the ponatinib story a bit. I guess a couple of things that, not to be a Debbie Downer on this study or not, but a couple of things. So when you see a patient and start them on bosutinib, what dose do you use? Do you actually use 500 or you start lower for the diarrhea issues?
Yeah, no, fair question. I always start lower. So that was tough to.
So the trial by making people start at 500 essentially kind of tips you in favor as far as toxicity from the get-go, right? So that's one issue.
Agreed. Strike one.
Yeah. So the other thing that I thought was interesting is that, nature, Darwin is always going to figure out a way to become resistant, right? And so you did see new emerging mutations in the asciminib arm. And I believe they were more than the bosutinib arm, which kind of, but the idea that even though, and I think it's kind of, again, it's sort of elegant in a cruel way, that even though you have a different mechanism of blocking ABL, the disease is still going to find a way to become resistant, right? And when you're dealing with third line patients, it's sort of like resistance is forever in a way, right? So Mr. Darwin will still have his way.
He does. And I think you're right. I think this was a tough patient group. These patients, some even had 4, some even had 5 lines of therapy. So they might have, we saw the profile of myristoyl pocket mutations. We saw that some of the ATP binding pocket mutations weren't always sensitive to asciminib either, and that requires a bit more investigation. I think overall mutations may be less frequently asciminib, but certainly possible and not exempt in any way.
And you're an expert on this, so where do you think this fits in the spectrum of cardiovascular toxicity? I'm guessing you would say imatinib and bosutinib are the lowest, and ponatinib is probably the highest.
True.
So where do you think the asciminib is going to fit in when all is said and done?
I immediately said in my head, hurry up and wait, because I think cardiovascular story has always been one that, you need a little bit of time to see it evolve. But on the other hand, the phase 1 study, we have patients on treatment 7-8 years plus at some pretty healthy doses. The interesting thing about asciminib is the dose range too. 40 milligrams twice a day, 80 once a day, versus 200 twice a day. That kind of worries some people. But when you've done a good phase 1 study and you've done it for a number of years, that those doses are safe. And the beauty of these targeted drugs is that we don't really see dose-limited toxicity. I'm not sure that's the story, but who knows? In the end, what we might see, people have speculated the more potent ABL inhibitor you have, the more potential you have for some cardiovascular toxicity because there's some overlap in tissue and target. Maybe it's some other modest effect on another kinase. It's hard to say. I think so far so reassuring. I wouldn't say absent, but reassuring. I think we see limited cardiovascular change with asciminib patients. Comparatively with bosutinib, it was there was slightly higher, but I think overall both those drugs are pretty well tolerated, and they both were better than some of our other choices. But obviously, we need more time. Yeah.
So in clinic, of your patients, what percentage of patients do you think fall into this category of third line? Have you figured out what to do? Is this like a 5%, 10%, 20%?
Since I only practice in the humble location in New York City, not in the River Nile or the but the patients coming to us may be, proportionally higher in this situation. Although, I think our colleagues, around the country, around the globe, I think they work pretty hard to try to fit drugs to patients. And some of the folks coming, because someone's thrown their hands up after two therapies or three therapies, and they're not sure what to do. But I'm glad to really help weigh in, because it's a tricky decision, and I think it's probably a good, a pretty significant proportion, a good third of consults for later lines of CML therapy are now candidates for this option. So I'm pleased that we have the option to offer, and it was great.
Now, is your phone ringing off the hook, or your Twitter feed, or whatever newfangled communication devices you youngsters have, from outside docs about, should my patient go on this stamp asciminib trial? Is it catching traction out there?
I think, thank goodness, this isn't. I say in my practice, your practice is similar, maybe out there in the West Coast. We see a lot of folks that are struggling. So we may see a higher proportion, but the good news is this is a niche. I think something we have to think about is maybe we could use these drugs even better. Maybe we should be using them a bit earlier, so we're not facing these challenges. So I wouldn't say the phone's ringing off the hook, because I think, thank goodness, the case burden is low, and maybe we're able to move a lot of these folks onto our trials. But I think the questions are out there, and I'm really intrigued to see, as we get more time and more patients treated outside of trials and in practice, and we see some more data from some trials that are running now, how we might be able to best use these drugs, because we're still looking for the holy grail of CML, which would be something better than what we have now, which is pretty good for sure. But that question always arises with these more potent inhibitors. Could they, it was raised with ponatinib, and it was just a toxicity question.
So you've got your ear to the ground here on this kind of stuff. Where are we going to use this drug next? I mean, do you see it coming in first line, second line? I mean, obviously it's going to move up the food chain. And how fast? I hear rumors that there's this CML Cancer Consortium I've heard about, and it might be doing a frontline therapy. Is there anything to that?
It could be. I think I've heard some rumors about that too. But full disclosure, you're quite involved and a leader for us, Jerry, and our U.S. colleagues. I think we like to work together in this consortium, and our goal is curing CML with treatment cessation type approaches. But we're clearly broadening out. CML Consortium, some other investigators around the world have begun to launch asciminib frontline trials. Asciminib treatment cessation, schemas. There's clearly a second line schema that's being developed. We see great potential. So I think our trial is going to look at patients just getting asciminib and then see how well it can perform. How can we break the glass ceiling? And then even thinking about optimizing response by adding another TKI, take advantage of that combination ability, and drive people home into even anyone who's lacking any kind of deep remission to get a high fraction of people to treatment-free remission. I think that's our.
So a pitch for this unique trial, frontline therapy, through the John H. Curry Cure CML Consortium. There's, I think, 17 centers out there that belong and will be enrolling patients. So if anyone hearing this has a promising patient that wants to get kind of the state-of-the-art stuff, find your local center and get them in.
Send them east, send them somewhere in between. We're all over the country, so we're glad to talk to people, help, consult, and enroll, obviously.
All right, well, I'm getting off. My next stop here, grabbing a Starbucks. Talk later.
Thank you, Jerry. That was great.
Remember, to receive your credit and evaluate this program, please visit morningcommutepodcast.com/CML2. Look for all of our podcasts on your favorite podcast streaming services, or download our Morning Commute app for your iPhone. Thank you for joining us today.